and Edward Eigen, who's our speaker for this evening, who's going to be speaking about, we see, a crash course in history. Ed, I know from Princeton University. He's born in New York, has a Master of Architecture from Columbia University in about '91. At that time, very young, he worked with Joan Achman on a book, Architecture Culture, a series of, it's called a documentary anthology, and it was a really important kind of collection of direct writings from history. So in inviting Ed for this talk, we're really interested in having Edward talk in terms of bringing history to life, or how does it matter. So his talk, and I could kind of go on in terms of other parts of his research. He did his PhD at MIT. He overlapped with the sciences, and I think this is where Ed's work is going to be most germane to what we're doing here at SCI-Arc in terms of our looking at the connection between the sciences, emergent technologies, and so forth, and the way it relates to architectural production. And I would just kind of say that Ed's work and his work as a writer is as much about the production of architecture as making architecture. I would say there's not going to be that division between history and theory and cultural studies and, let's say, practice, because there's often this idea of a division. So it's something that I kind of firmly believe in my work as a cultural kind of writer as well. So many of the books that he's written have, there's one that I have here, Architecture and the Sciences, that was edited by Antoine Piconde, who's at Harvard, and Alessandra Ponte, and Ed has a kind of a really fabulous essay in that. And his work really focuses, and he'll talk about it more, but his work really focuses on the emergence of the biological sciences and machines and technology and automata in the 19th century. And I think it's really, really critical for a way to look at kind of the precursor to so much of the technology and allow us to have a critical relationship of how we use technology here in the 21st century. I won't go on and on. One of my favorite essays Ed has written, and I'm a visual artist as well, was an essay he wrote in a book that was edited by Carol Armstrong on the cyanotype, which are contact print drawings by Anna Atkins. What was the date, Ed? 1858, something like this. And Ed was able to talk about these. Their cyanotype is like the blueprint, and the essay that Ed wrote, and I guess this is where I'll verge from kind of the introduction of the formal, who's who of Ed Eigen. But Ed was able to, in that essay, talk about color. And I really don't think I've ever met anyone who's able to write kind of across, using language in a way, both in his writing and when he speaks, that kind of weaves together a tapestry that I think that it would be a parallel to the way we work as architects. So I could go on, but I'm going to let Ed kind of take over from there, if that's okay. Okay? Thanks.
I can't see anyone, but that's fine. Yeah. I feel like I'm making my bar mitzvah speech here with this. I want to thank Alicia for inviting me to SCI-Arc this evening. And if I have the jitters for the first few moments, it's because SCI-Arc has always intimidated me. It's way cool. So look, as Alicia indicated, I wanted to say a few words tonight about my engagement in the field of history. I work primarily as a historian, and at the risk of saying something that sounds like it comes right out of James Lipton's Actors Studio kind of mishigas, vis-a-vis this kind of question of architecture and practice, what have you, I very seriously consider the work of the historian a type of craft and practice, its own type of discipline. And what I'm going to try to do tonight is address some of the issues that come up in the work, as it were, and try to implicate, as I go, a very rudimentary instrument of architectural production in the writing of history, and all the while trying to say a few words about accidents. So thank you for coming, and I'll launch in and see where this goes. So I am not prepared today, nor perhaps will I ever be, to provide a satisfying response to the question, what is history? That, of course, was the subject famously addressed by E.H. Carr as the 1961 GM Trevelyan Lectures at the University of Cambridge. In the first of the 6 lectures, Carr developed the theme that, quote, the historian is engaged in a continuous process of molding his facts to his interpretation and his interpretation to his facts. And I won't bore you with the details of how that's done, but by the very sense of molding, you can already get a sense that something's being worked and crafted in the process. Instead of going on about this question, what is history? Instead, let's attend to a little classroom drama, this being Alan Bennett's The History Boys, his play about high schoolers preparing to sit for exams, and here you see them in the full dudgeon of an excited lesson, and their teacher, Hector, seen here on the right, and you can perhaps imagine why I have a certain affinity for Hector. In any case, set in Cutler's grammar school in what is vaguely taken to be the industrial town of Sheffield, where it is the relatively rare boy who goes up to Cambridge or Oxford, the story resonates with Bennett's own self and class consciousness as a scholarship boy at a time when Oxford and Cambridge were as daunting and mysterious to him as they were for his fictive history boys. And so it seems SCI-Arc for me. The wider and more worrying drama, The History Boys, is drawn by Bennett in his notes to the play, where he speaks of the literal demolition of his old school, the modern school of Leeds, upon which Cutler is modeled. A handsome and decent piece of architecture from the 1930s, Bennett notes with regret, its replacement had none of the old school's, old building's dignity, and this is the rub of it, none of its confidence. In the 1930s, the future state of education seemed assured. Now, who knows? Set in the mid-'80s, the age of Thatcher, and I realize some of the undergrads might not have any lived recollection of who Margaret Thatcher is, so I present this portrait in her floral glory here with her spiritual counterpart, Ronald Reagan, a product of your own home state. Set in the 1980s, the age of Thatcher, the play speaks to a more fundamental act of demolition, more fundamental, that is, than the destruction of this school, that of wider reading, or what we might call learning for learning's sake, which might lead us to inquire, and especially in a school of architecture, why study history, being arguably just an aspect of wider learning, or learning for learning's sake. To that still more profound query, all I can offer in response is, just do it. I'll show you how, but at your own risk. So here's something I read to my own students upon this subject from an essay by Charles Perrault. You might have heard of his brother, Claude Perrault, he of Arbitrary Beauty fame. This is from an essay he wrote entitled Paradox, that it is not useful for every man to become learned. Perrault writes, he should therefore cut back upon his studies, or even abandon them, if he cannot refrain from the bad habit of quoting passages at every turn. It is evident in that case that his knowledge dominates and governs his mind, whereas his mind ought to govern his knowledge. And evidently I here stand accused by making reference to good old Charles. But there is something to this sentiment on the paradox of that it is not useful for every man to become learned. There's something to this in how Bennett recalls preparing for his own scholarship exams, that experience, however fraught, that resonates so widely in The History Boys. It was a process of reducing everything he knew to fit on cards, which he carried with him everywhere. Handy arguments, quotations, a whole examination kit. In the event, however, taking the exam, he also caught on to the fact there was to it what he called a journalistic side to answering examination questions. That going for the wrong end of the stick was more attention-grabbing than a more conventional approach, however balanced. Yet nobody had tutored him in these techniques, or even conceded that such techniques existed, probably due to the notion that all such considerations were practically indecent. And if you want to get a sense in this, sit on a jury review at the end of the semester and you can hear certain pat phrases occur again and again and again. And this is the product of reviewers who go from school to school to school and hear these wonderful and winning phrases in spite of, or far less often than because of the project at hand. But what about this pat learning, which seems to run in the face of learning for learning's sake, or wider reading? The sense that it is below consideration, that it is practically indecent. This particularly is the fustian attitude, so winningly, if nonetheless losingly, espoused by Hector, who, guiding his boys to the various and consoling pleasures of learning for learning's sake, is pitted against Erwin in a pitched battle of substance over presentation, staking out the difference between knowledge and education. Knowledge is not general. It is specific, says Hector, and nothing to do with getting on, by which he means knowledge is not something we take with us, like that examination kit, and apply to fit to the situation in a winning manner. It's something to be born. And we'll come back to this notion, I think, in conclusion, if I ever arrive there. But in this distinction between, let's say, presentation and knowledge, substance and form, a long and pitted road has been traveled since the time Thomas de Quincey, writing of the defects of English style, considered most typically the tendency, as he writes, to value the matter of a book not only as paramount to the manner, but even as distinct from it, and as capable of separate insulation. The well-insulated Hector would have his boys read books that are not on the curriculum. The pedagogy is transparent. He tells them, you may not understand it now, but one day life will make its meaning clear. And that might not be a happy occasion, we might add. Indeed, their reading is the little preparation Hector can give them for the long littleness of life. Now, against Hector, we have this other character, Erwin. Erwin is a recent Oxford graduate and is brought in by the scheming headmaster to coach the brightest boys on how to impress the examiners at Oxford and Cambridge. Teaching to the test, as we might call it now in the era of No Child Left Behind, which I always find odd if any of you have read the Left Behind series of a radical messianic Christian persuasion, which are truly extraordinarily bizarre. But in any case, No Child Left Behind. So think back to our friend E.H. Carr and the molding of facts to interpretations and interpretations to facts. For Erwin advises the boys, in interpreting so-called facts, truth is besides the point. Win the argument, impress, dazzle with your wit. History these days is not a matter of conviction, he says, it's a performance. So how am I doing so far, okay? It is not surprising then that by the play's end, Erwin evolves from a teacher to a TV don, and then from lecturing about the dissolution of the monasteries to becoming a government spokesman. He becomes a spin master. And just as Carr's lectures were broadcast on the BBC, imagine tuning into that stuff between Kevin and Bean bits, the TV channels now overflow with history. All Hitler, all the time. You know the stuff. And I'm just picking on one of my old teachers here, Simon Schama, who just completed this compendious televised history of Britain with this glorious endorsement on the CD kit, which you can now apprise yourself of the history of Britain from ancient Albion to current day. So what happens in this confrontation? Erwin would seem to have his way. A mock interview is staged, and the boys given a fighting chance to meld style and substance. Rudge, one of the students, is questioned. Now, how do you define history, Mr. Rudge? Can I speak freely without being hit, he responds. See, Hector, you should know, is fond of swatting his students on the head. which I can't speak to the pedagogic value of that technique, but in any case, he also takes other indiscreet liberties, improbably while riding with his students on his motorcycle, the exposure of which fleshes out the play's concern with the erotics of pedagogy. And here again, I won't bore you with the details. So, how do I define history, Rudge says? Well, it's just one fucking thing after another. And as far as I can tell, that just about sums it up. The question that is, what is history? It's truly one fucking thing after another. Except for the historian, it matters somewhat, it does not matter so much what comes first or last, because it all comes out the same in the end. But what we concern ourselves with is the maddening middles of things, to be in media res, to be caught between those two infinitudes, as Pascal called them. And when he spoke of our vocation in life, he had that beautiful phrase, we are already embarked. Okay, we are already at sea and running the peril therewith. The maddening middles of things, the one fucking thing after another. So as historians, and I'm asking you to try on a historian's hat just for an hour or so, we might ask, how do they line up? And with that question, I want to implicate, as I mentioned earlier, the most rudimentary of architectural tools, the straightedge, in the writing of history. And this will become a bit of a leitmotif throughout this talk. I'm just that clever. I can invent leitmotifs, but let's say it'll be mentioned again. So the straightedge. And you will have to forgive me, but I went to architecture school before there was Rhino and Katya. And indeed, a couple of my classmates are in the room tonight, and they could perfectly well testify to the fact that I couldn't draw a straight line if my life depended on it, which only confirms that old dictum, those who can't do teach, and those who can't teach Jim. But in any case, what am I on about, this straight edge? Well, in thinking about history recently, I take great inspiration from this image, which in fact serves as the frontispiece to a book from 1741 by one Nicolas André. The title is Orthopedia, or the Art of Correcting and Preventing Deformities in Children by such means as may be put into practice by parents themselves and all such as are employed in educating children. I am one such person so employed. So what you see in this frontispiece is an allegorical scene of a seated mother. I have my laser pointer. And this lovely ruler, the straight edge, hoc est regula recti. This is the rule for straightness. With this, we will make children straight. We will make them overcome their deformities, whether inborn or somehow born upon them. And I particularly like this image in as much as there's this drapery that's pulled back to expose this rather solid and somber Doric order, as if to suggest that architecture might provide the model for uprightness, for some sense of true bearing. But we shouldn't lose fact that the Greeks, from whom Vitruvius derived that lovely word encyclopedos, or rounded learning, as opposed to orthopedos in the title, orthopedics, which is straight growth or straight learning, that even the Greeks knew from Entasis. They knew that the orders had to be curved somehow to satisfy the eye, these subtle optical corrections that need to be incorporated even when we are drawing these straight lines. And it's this straight line, this ruler, this regula, and you can see the word regular in there, which I'll bring to bear on the notion of the normal in a moment or two in regard to narrative. This regula seems to me somehow implied in the question of what happens when we draw those narrative lines. How do we begin to understand one fucking thing after another? So if I ask you, what is history? Seek not the right answer, okay? Don't go to your crib notes, your examination kit. History is not rule or, as it were, ruler bound. It is one thing after another, but what an unpredictable path it describes. And I should say a varying and, let's say, curvilinear path, and we'll show you just how funny those curves can become in a moment. But I show you this other image from Andri's treatise on orthopedy. This is the, this image now serves as the emblem for several orthopedic societies around the world, and we see the growth of the tree obviously being a child. Here we can remember that beautiful line from Alexander Pope, "'Tis education forms the common mind, just as the twig is bent, the tree's inclined." So we might find ourselves in that situation of binding up the tree, which has its own not so subtle erotics to it, to make it straight. This is the rule, right, to apply it. But let's follow these curves, these paths, these incidents where things don't go so straight and normal. So let's return to our drama and Hector's all too tender attempt to nurture intellectually his redeemingly unruly history boys. And Richard Griffiths, I'm sure, would love to have his teeth shown at that scale, but so be it. We return to our drama. Having successfully sat for their interviews, in the performance of which truth and perhaps also knowledge is sacrificed to another, though arguably lesser good, the boys have an opportunity to engage in history for themselves. That is, at Hector's memorial service. Barred from offering his boys rides on his motorbike, Hector takes Erwin, the spin master, for a ride. There are various theories about what happened, why he came off, one of the history boys says. Erwin ends up in a wheelchair. For Hector, the crash proves fatal. Erwin has no better clue, and he was in the back seat. He says, "With no memory of what happened, I am no help. I only know what I have been told. In my last memory, Dakin asking me for a drink." Which is to say, Erwin is truly crippled. He is fated to know the course of his own life only through what others tell him. Still worse, as a spin doctor, the public he serves is fated to know only what he tells them. In any case, memory fails. The instant of the crash is occluded. Something has to be made up. So Erwin says, "My last memory was Dakin asking me for a drink." Well, having a drink is a euphemism. That Dakin knows well. Though ever a student of Hector, he knows that it isn't. Dakin says, "A euphemism is a nice way of saying something nasty," he explains, "whereas a drink is a nice way of saying something nice." But obviously something else was being asked of him. He never did have his drink, as it were, which Erwin himself regrets. He explains to one of his classmates why. It was the wheelchair. Still, at least I asked him. And barring accidents, it would have happened. Here's the subjunctive mood that Hector loves so much. Would have, ought have, should have, might have. History in the subjunctive mood is something I would think is very important for us to consider, as opposed to some kind of declarative stating the facts. And at this point, Rudge provides the necessary conditional clause to his definition of history. There is no barring accidents. It's what I said. History is just one fucking thing after another. Now, E.H. Carr took sharp aim at historians who underline the part played in history by what he calls the accidental, the contingent, and those who exhibit skepticism concerning the possibility of discerning rational direction or progress in the course taken by events. This would be straight line history, what some call Whig history. We might call these skeptics Pyrrhonists, but that's a whole other story. But it does force us to consider this clause, there is no barring accidents. Do accidents fall outside of history, or are they the stuff of which history is made? And that is what I want to address tonight, by reference to a particular case of death by architecture. Any questions? Cool. So here's our case. Le Figaro, Wednesday, October 23rd, 1895. We read, "A fantastical, unprecedented, unbelievable accident took place yesterday at the Gare Montparnasse. At precisely 4 o'clock, an unbearable din, like the noise of an explosion, was suddenly heard." And here I'm reading from the account. "A chunk of stone from the facade of the station was violently projected forward. Then, a locomotive, exiting through the breach in the wall, fell to the Place de Rennes in the middle of a crowd of bewildered passers-by. Just as in the spot was a car of the Étoile de Montparnasse, the Étoile to Montparnasse omnibus line filled with passengers. With the sound of the shattering glass and breaking stonework, its draw horse startled. And even though the brakes were on the carriage, the startled animal pulled the car out of the way of the wreckage, the descending train. This was miraculous good luck," the Figaro added. "No one was hurt." Still more miraculously, and yes, I would say there is a calculus to miracles, no one on the train was killed. However, Marie Augustine Camille Aguillard, 37 years old, residing at 1 Rue Guillauminet, mother of 2 children, ages 6 and 9, was struck by one of the stones jettisoned from the building, hit on the head, leading to her instantaneous death. She was standing in that day for her husband at the newspaper kiosk he ran in front of the station. Bad effing luck. So is it cruel to suppose that he wasn't vending Le Figaro on the morning of the 23rd? Death by architecture. Now, what strikes me, Alicia mentioned this question, my interest in technology, and it is the case that I teach a course on architecture and machines, and I am in love with trains, planes, and automobiles. But what strikes me about this image, again, for all the drama of it, drama that in some cases is self-evident, in some cases needs to be invented, it is not finally the train which causes this death, or at least not proximately. It's this stone dislodged from this structure. So we will get into the details of the accident in a minute. And with accidents, which are by nature irreducibly singular, what is more satisfying, because difficult, than sorting out the details? One thing after another? Well, we are led, with accidents, we are led along this line, as it were, even if it's not a straight line, by a trail of debris to an inaccessible origin, the cause, necessarily contented with sorting out the aftermath. One thing after another? Well, we, historians, arrive well, but not certainly after the fact. But about the lead, and remember, never bury your lead. It rehearses all that is typical about accidents before ever getting to the facts. The accident was fantastical, it was unprecedented, truly unbelievable. The Magasin Picturesque, writing in its next week's edition, wrote, "It is an accident, a unique accident in the history of the railroads." Again, I like this because the insistence upon unique, as if there was going to be some other accident just like it. The irreducibility of accidents is precisely what attracts us, but also, again, that there is, at this point in time, a history of the railroads. Such emphatically bewildered sentiment, however, again, the fantastical, the unprecedented, the unbelievable, speaks to the robust endurance of wonder in the face of a stringent conceptual Darwinism, which would seek to explain away the unique, the unprecedented, the singular, and the prodigious, if not simply by minimizing their effects. And I should mention that the New York Times, which devoted 174 words to the accident in question, reports immense crowds of people attracted by curiosity lingered in the vicinity of the station for hours, rubbernecking, as it were. But what about this desire to extirpate the exceptional? I would put this in a slightly broader historical framework, an intellectual framework. And here I'm referring particularly to Lorraine Daston and Catherine Park, who write in their marvelous book, Wonder and the Order of Nature, that around the mid-18th century, a new ethos of utility, which led to these technological innovations, was linked to an increasing emphasis on the replication of experiment and the stabilization of effect. In order to be made useful, nature had to be made uniform, consistent. Phenomena which persisted in rarity or variability or irregularity, be it a meteorites, electrophosphorescence, figured stones, all these accidents of nature, lusus naturae, as they were called, plays or freaks of nature, were no longer a fit object for science. Daston and Park speak of this change in terms of what they call the Enlightenment and the anti-marvelous, a strain of moral, philosophical, and aesthetic reasoning that placed credence in nature's decorum, its fitness, its rightness. It wouldn't offend. And you can think of Horace's Art of Poetry, where he tells us not to mix the different parts of animals to make some kind of freakish amalgam, a monster, what he calls a purple patch in an otherwise noble fabric. This is decorum. Its intolerance of vulgar exceptions, of caprice. Nature was governed by immutable laws, and these laws ensured that natural phenomena were always regular and uniform. The sun shall rise tomorrow, right? And as they are quick to point out, this second premise, that nature was regular and uniform, that it was decorous, flew in the face of daily experience, which is to say, day by day, stuff happens. And often it is without reason or precedent, at least in one's own experience. And also, however, it ran in the face of much hard-earned experience, which is to say, in some experimental practice. In this regard, I would say that accidents are ready-made experiments in historical explanation. Now, if we can speak in this way, and again, I am making a very general gesture with this reference to this strain of Enlightenment reason, if we can speak about the eradication of accidents or the way of minimizing the effect by trying to understand the uniformity of underlying causes, we might then ask, well, why then do accidents take place? Why do they persist? Or perhaps more properly, why do we continue to be so fascinated by them? So I thought I would hone in here a bit more closely and carefully and look at the explanation that's given at least by those who operated the railroads in the 19th century, who are responsible for precisely the lines that went awry at Montparnasse that day, October 22, 1895. And I'm reading to you here from this absolutely extraordinary series of books that was published by the Ministry of the Travaux Publics, the Public Works, edited by Léonce Reynaud, who is quite possibly the most understudied architect in history. In any case, this is a series of volumes that had to do with the bridges, the roads, the railroads, and other such works, which are very gorgeously illustrated by photographs by Baldus and Duclos and others. They're as interesting from the point of view of photography as they are from documentation. But the point for us is that in this particular volume on the railroads, as you can see, Chemin de Fer, Edward Collignon anatomizes accidents, as it were. He tells us accident prevention, again, which is already, from our contemporary point of view, a bit of a misnomer. For if we read someone like Paul Virilio in his Accidentology, he'll tell us to invent a railroad is to invent the railroad accident. Okay, so we're in the business of accident production. But in any case, he tells us accident prevention should be the principal occupation of those who administer the railroad. Gestion, administration, keeping things right. And so better to administer the rails along each mile of which, at every hour of the day, accidents lie in wait. And to lie in wait is a strategic term, to seek out that proper moment when things are just right or miserably wrong. Collingwood sensibly arranges accidents into three classes. These would be accidents due to the rails, breakages, ruptures, snows, obstructions, obstacles, things placed there by malevolence, what have you. Accidents owing to equipment, steam boilers blow up, gauges go wrong, what have you. But the chiefest cause, or the largest class of these accidents, is what he calls accidents due to the inobservation of rules. Okay, so I bring you back to hoc est regula recti. This is the rule for straightness. So we might have cause to think here that, again, accidents very much are a part of that turn, that shift, when we are not following the straight lines. Well, the rules be damned. Allow me to loop back to our notion of the straight edge and the drawing of historical narratives. Okay. And here I'll give you that second version of our regula, our ruler. And I do this by, with regard to the kind of very meaning of narration itself. It's one fucking thing after another. Well, tell that story if you will. Narration, J. Hillis Miller writes, is a member of a family of words that includes normal, to bring back that term, from the Latin norma, meaning a measuring stick or a ruler or regula. It refers to lines drawn with a T-square. However, most narratives, or at least the most interesting narratives, are crooked. And so too the most interesting people, right? The crooked timbers of our soul. So the trick for the historian is to preserve narrative anomalies, these sways, these swerves, these accidents, parented of mischance, of poor planning, or deliberate inaction, in such a way, or just long enough, to see what it reveals about the ostensibly normal course of events. And here's a model for you. And what I'm showing you, probably most of you know this, are the famous squiggly lines from Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy. You know the novel. It's an autobiographical relation of Tristram's life, beginning with his own conception, which he witnesses from within the bedroom. And what happens is Tristram is telling the story of his uncle Toby, who was grievously injured at the Battle of Namur, and he becomes a bit upset with himself because he has not followed a straight line. His story has all sorts of prolapses and reverses and swerves and tunnels back, what have you. Now, in drawing these squiggly lines, which are a linear diagram of narrative, which are anything but our straight line, hoc is regula recti, Stern is making great work of Hogarth's line of variety, this serpentine line, which we find everywhere in English gardens during this period. But to counsel you against trying to straighten things out, as it were, to allow perhaps this type of thinking or reasoning, linear reasoning, into our writing of history and telling about one thing after another, let's just listen to Tristram for 1 second as he sits in judgment upon himself, because Tristram, after examining this output, thinks perhaps maybe he should go on the straight and narrow. And in the book, which has all sorts of postmodern little pyrotechnics, he draws a straight line below this, and he tells us, this is the line drawn as straight as I could draw it, by a writing master's ruler, borrowed for the purpose, turning neither to the right nor to the left, the right line, the pathway for Christians to walk in, say divines. but singularly unsatisfying. So let me say a few more words about this third class, this failure then to observe the rules, to follow the norm, to deviate, that comprises, in Collignon's estimation, the greatest number of the most severe accidents. And when I say estimation, I should say this is based on just 40 statistical studies. And if you do want to study the 19th century, you really have to learn to read statistics. They're a lot of fun, I promise you. But in any case, he points out some of the problems. Signalage is a central issue. And I show this extraordinary painting by Monet of the Gare Saint-Lazare, where you see these signals being all but obscured by what is formless, what we might call the circumstantial, which defies and ultimately defeats the possibility of a clear signal. And these are an intrinsic duality in our reasonings on the railroad, which unfortunately I will not have time to talk about. But he says signaling, not paying attention to the signals. Not observing the schedule is another source of grief. And we'll come back to that in a second with our accident at Montparnasse. Then there are various forms of inattention. Collignon tells us, habit occasionally produces in tired minds singular hallucinations. You've probably all experienced them in class. You might be experiencing them right now. I apologize. In any case, Collignon makes certain that to assure the public, when accidents arrive, except for cases of force majeure, and here the language of insurance underwriters, force majeure, he tells us it is not the fault of the rules, but it is owing to the inobservation of the rules. The fault lies not in the stars, it lies in ourselves. Now, one way we can look into this is by reference to the simple fact, and the joyous one for the historian, that accidents produce records. And I should say parenthetically that insurance companies are among the most jealous custodians of records. Indeed, they are in the provident business of assessing fortune and risk. But then again, accidents destroy records. The historian Marc Bloch writes that a society organizes rational self-knowledge by controlling its records instead of depending on calamities for its information, which is to say, we must be careful what accidents befall our collective memory. What I want to do very quickly is read a few of these reports, if you will, which come from the archives of the Travaux Publics, the public works in Paris, under a file titled Accidents, F149561, if you want to consult it. And just give a quick sense of the reporting and what type of, again, calculus is taking place. Any station agent along the French line was required to submit a report when anything untoward happened at a station. So to begin with, we get the imprudent. Here from the chief engineer at I'm sorry, I forgot to note the town here. June 27, 1857. I have the honor of transmitting to you a report on the engineer of the Ponts de Chaussée, Monsieur Boulanger, on an accident involving one Richard, an engineer at the station at Metz. I believe, as with Monsieur Boulanger, that Richard lacked prudence in undertaking a dangerous maneuver in spite of the warning given by the station chief. He wasn't following sage advice. In consequence, the report reads, there is no need to pursue judicial action. Well, imprudence. Then there's the pathetic. Here, from an engineer along the Paris to Lyon line, an accident took place 27 February, 3:15 in the evening, between kilometer markers 255 and 256. One Artaud, a farmer, deaf-mute since birth, an idiot, wanting to cross the tracks to take refuge during a rainstorm, was struck by the engine of passenger train number 11 and killed by the blow. His left arm was cut off and head bruised. I assume as part of the accident and not thereafter. Then there's the inebriated, or perhaps these hallucinatory moments. Here from the Compagnie de Chemin de Fer de l'Est, in 1857. One Foray, having during 26 September had several libations, and against the warning of his friends, persisted in walking home by following the train line. It is probable that overcome by drunkenness, he went to sleep on the track and was taken by surprise by the train. And then finally, I would say the all too typical, and this one is what perhaps matters for us most. This is the Chemin de Fer Lyon to the Mediterranean line, which report speaks of 2 accidents, the engineer says, without consequence. The first, in which 2 empty wagons, perfectly wedge-blocked in the station, were set in motion by the violence of the wind and began rolling down the track, which is to say, if you're going to study accidents, you definitely have to study the weather, which is a great subject. The chief of the station no other way of stopping them than by derailment, and this held up passenger train number 7, which is to say a delay occurred, which is the worst possible situation. But finally, and perhaps I think the case that proves our rule here, the 27th June at 9 in the morning, a match was left burning in the office of the commissionaire of the station of Sète, causing a fire. However, the only thing that was destroyed was the Recueil des lois, décrets et ordonnances, which is to say, the rule book, which we might then add, this too shall burn. So the rules go up in flames, and accidents clearly overcome our desire for control or gestion or administration. Let me say one thing, why I have this slide up here to entertain you while I read these little reports in the archives, besides the fact that I am PowerPoint challenged. What I like about these reports, and in the way for me they feed in a bit to what we have to say about accidents, is that this spark, what we might call the touch of the real, this access to a particular instant and the means by which we can make it live again. And here I refer in my second and hopefully very brief conceptual gesture to the book by the French historian Michel Foucault, this book called The Lives of Infamous Men, which is the introduction, this essay really, to an anthology of the archives of the Hôpital Général and the Bastille, to which people were confined against their will. And this Foucault collected what he called singular lives, lives with a few lines or a few pages, nameless misfortunes and adventures gathered into a handful of words, such as this inebriated man who one night, upon this evening in 1857, met his end on the tracks. Strange poems, he calls them, like this herbarium, this collection of strange flowers. Here's one. It sounds somewhat like our own. His madness was always to hide from his family, to lead an obscure life in the country, to have actions at law, to lend usuriously and without security, to lead his feeble mind down unknown paths, okay, and to believe himself capable of the greatest employments. I can think of several architects who fit that bill. In any case, these anecdotes were drawn from the archives of confinement, of police, petitions to the kings, lettres de cachet, or they provide the pretense by which we have people taken or removed from society. But it is in virtue of these letters, in these strange poems, these few words, that these lives entered official discourse, and with it, that they were given access to perpetuity in the very moment of their condemnation. The most intense points of their lives are the moment of their encounter with power. Foucault writes, these words are what give to them, in order to travel through time, that brief flash of sound and fury which carries them even to us. He likens it to a lightning bolt. And this is how such a rare chain of events was linked. Them to us, the past to the present, that one thing after another. And this is how it was conducted. It's accidental in essence. Chance carried it from the beginning. It first required a combination of circumstances that, contrary to all expectations, focused the attention of power and the outbursts of its anger on the most obscure individual, on his mediocre life. Remember, Hector preparing the students for the great littleness of life. On his, after all, rather ordinary faults. A stroke of misfortune that caused the vigilance of officials or of institutions, aimed no doubt at suppressing all disorder, to pick up this person rather than that, this scandalous monk, this beaten woman, this inverted and furious drunkard, this quarrelsome merchant, and not so many others who were just making as much of a ruckus. And then it has to be just this document, among so many others scattered and lost, which came down to us to be rediscovered and read by some aimless historian such as myself. So that between these people of no importance, at least to us, and us who have no more importance than they, there is no necessary connection. There is no one thing after another. Nothing made it likely for them to emerge from the shadows, they instead of others, with their lives and their sorrows. We may amuse ourselves otherwise if we wish, by seeing a revenge in this, the chance, that fortune, that unprecedented, that whole sense of wonder that enabled these absolutely indistinguishable people to emerge from their place amid the dead multitudes, to gesticulate again, to manifest their rage, their affliction, or their invincible determination to err. Perhaps it makes up for the bad luck that brought power's lightning bolt down upon them in the first place, in spite of their modesty and anonymity. And of course, I'm speaking about all of us. And I'm quite sure when some of you have been pulled aside on the highway for speeding, and you say to the cop, well, that guy was going just as fast, why not him? Well, you're engaging in the same thing. Now, the historian Stephen Greenblatt underscores two paradoxes when it comes to our work as historians, and specifically in relation to this passage from this French historian I've just read. The first is the fragility of sources, the accidents that befall the documents we have to work with to begin with. Foucault writes of his selection of these lifelines, these strange poems, as it were, chanced upon in books, conformed to nothing more important, he says, than my taste, my pleasure, an emotion, laughter, surprise, a certain fright or some feeling whose intensity, perhaps, I would have difficulty justifying now that the first flush of discovery is past. And this, for me, is the rub. As Greenblatt writes, for the historian clutches in his hands the life of the anecdote, but it expires in his or her grasp. We have access to these things, and our very handling of them threatens their silence. This is what I tell my students is kind of a reverse alchemy, when you turn gold into shit, right? You find something in the archives, and by your very handling of it, by molding your interpretation to the facts, and mind you, I haven't bothered to find facts just yet, something is lost. Now, after having this slide on for so very long, I'll come to explain it. This is from a book by Camille Flammarion, who was a very important popularizer of science in the 19th century, astronomer, a believer of life on other planets. This is from his book, The Caprice of Lightning. You recall that we'd spoken about this visitation of power as a lightning bolt. This is something I studied in another context because, as I said, Flammarion is incredibly interested in statistics, or just how often and where people got struck by lightning. But the relevance of this story here is that of the various forms and curious ways in which lightning exhibits itself. He says there are those cases where it strikes a person, and you see this group of farmers who have gathered underneath this tree to seek shelter, just like our deaf mute who wanted to seek shelter from the rain was struck by the train. It strikes them in such a way that they are, as he calls, petrified. They remain in place, but life has been wrested by them. Wrested from them. But what's so compelling about this, Flammarion tells us, is that the minute you go out and touch them, they crumble into ash. That life-likeness, that verisimilar that Dafton and Park spoke about is lost. And it's that touch of the historian that we always have to be worried of, when that precious remnant, by our mere attention to it, is somehow destroyed. Okay. Let me come back then to our crash. What happened? Well, let me begin with what should have happened. because it's been argued here that the normative, the regular, that straight line is perhaps how things ought to go. It's the orthopedic, it's orthographic, it's straight, it's correct. So what ought to have happened? The express train 56, leaving from the Norman town of Granville at 8:45 in the morning on the 22nd, should have arrived at Montparnasse station at 3:55. However, owing to problems in stations up the line, this express was running late. The engineer tried to make up time, and the train was operating, as it was reported, at a far greater speed than normal. Okay, I'm just emphasizing that, that term normal. Normal according to what? Well, according to the straight lines, along which trains in France traveled at the time. What you're seeing here, many of you have probably seen this before, is the graphique des trains, the schedule that was drawn by Etienne Jules Marais, which linearized the geography of France and showed station by station, point to point, where any train would be at any moment of the day, allowing for connection between stations. These are straight lines. This is the ought. This is the should. This is where, if I want to know where a train was at 6:15 in the morning between Nantes and Rennes, on any given day during this period, I can look and have a fairly good sense that, well, there it was. Unless, of course, it was traveling at a speed far greater than normal, than was, let's say, recommended, owing to the fact that prior to that, it had been running late. Add to that the Westinghouse pneumatic brakes didn't function. Let's just say, get out of the way. How should things happen that morning? Well, I show you these series of film stills from the film produced by the Lumiere brothers, one of the very first motion pictures shown in Paris. In fact, this film was shown but 1 month after the extraordinary accident at the Gare Montparnasse. The film is entitled The Arrival of the Train at La Ciotat. And what we see is the empty track, people on the platform awaiting the arrival of the train arrives, the passengers descend. If you believe urban legend, people in the theater fled in horror, thinking that the train was going to run them over. You can grant that whatever credence you want, but it is curious that this film was shown but a month after our accident in question. But the point is, here, captured in this remarkably new medium, is what should have happened. The train arrives, normal, straight, according to the rules, things kept on schedule, one thing after another. What happened at Montparnasse? Well, the Magasin Picturesque tells us that in front of stupefied employees screaming, "It's a crazed train," the locomotive broke through the wall, supporting the great glass arches opening onto the Place des Rennes, plummeting to the sidewalk meters below. Now, and here you see this, I'm sorry this reproduced very poorly, but this is actually quite a striking engraving. It appears here. What I want to focus on is this passage right here, which to me says so much about our work as historians, especially those historians who have attended to the crash course of history. It was said here, it was said earlier that history is one fucking thing after another. Well, I want to, in this last section, try to give another resonance to that term after. Which is to say, we read here in this passage, in light of the rarity of such similar occurrences, we thought it interesting to reproduce the appearance of the Gare Montparnasse after the fall of the locomotive. Okay, which already gets us this question of during and after. What can we know about the during? Remember, Irwin, who was there, has no recollection of falling off the bike. He has barely a recollection of getting in it. What perhaps intrigues me about accidents more than anything else is that, again, going back to some of the larger comments I've made this evening, that we might tend to think of accidents as interrupting narrative history, interrupting those straight lines of narration, of before and after. Let's say, most generally, the unities of time, place, and action. But what I found is that accidents, and particularly the study of accidents, force us, really reinforce those continuities. In the absence of the ability to get at that during, we always are at a loss then to go to before and after. It's a very difficult problem. So here we have the after. History is one thing after another. So I'm going to give a picture the magazine Picturesque tells us of the locomotive after the accident. Well, to highlight the issue, perhaps to highlight the melancholy rearward gaze of the historian, the magazine Picturesque would double this meaning. They tell us our engraving, executed after a photograph, taken immediately after the accident, gives a very exact idea. Well, an exact idea, that is, of the aftermath. Okay. Now, we can point here, and we could say, well, this is just simply a concern with the verisimilar. Mechanical reproduction subsuming into itself the assurance of the probable. This is quite likely how it appeared, if not perhaps how it occurred. And it's precisely this meaning that is expressed in the Figaro that morning. They tell us, one could judge from the position of the train, one could judge the position of the train is from the very exact drawing which appears in the paper. We say very exact because the drawing is made here again, not after a sketch, but after a superb photograph, a veritable masterpiece. And here we show this somewhat compromised vision of the accident from page 3 of the Figaro. And here, just by comparison, how these degenerate. This is from the Bristol Daily News, where we lose very much of the fine texture of this event, but very much in its exchange, getting these stones, which really did the great accident. Well, we can ask, what came before? Before the train broke through the Gare Montparnasse, a piece of its facade landing on the pauvre Marie Aguillard, killing her instantly. Well, the journal La Nature, edited by Gaston de Sandier, is, in its cool-headed report, suggests that the inquiry of the engineers of the controllers, responsible for the administration and the gestion of the company of railroads, will permit, without doubt, they say, to render. Okay, we're going from getting the picture right, getting things after the right image, to some kind of render, but here in a specific sense. Rendre compte, comptabilité, to do that accounting, as it were, to get all the facts on this balance sheet. You say, will give us the ability to render the responsibility incumbent upon the engineers, Guillaume-Marie Pellerin, especially from the point of view, they tell us, of the in-execution of the rules. The Magazin Picturesque says that the judicial inquiry initiated with the design of discovering the causes of the accident established that the engineer acted contrary to the special rules for the trains approaching Montparnasse, these having to do with the use of these Westinghouse brakes, which in any case failed. But we're getting here with this inquiry is, again, some attempt to reestablish the rules, some notion of the norm, the regular, which only perhaps the case of the accident can bring into very sharp relief. So I want to conclude with this sentiment, and you're probably thrilling to that word conclusion. In any case, in his work, Transportation by Sea and Air, Documents for an Economic History of the Third Republic by Paul Vibert, who is, I guess you'd call him a man of letters about town. You might know the work of his father, Theodore Vibert, who had some very peculiar racial theories, which were all the rage at the moment. But in any case, in this book, this compendium of documents, Paul Vibert seeks to draw a lesson from the accident. He writes, and this is, and I refer here, again, by way of conclusion, to a passage from Sir Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry. And we could be assured that Hector knew it, which informs my own project as a historian. For in it, Sidney pits precept, by which we might read rules, lessons, those things to be appealed to when we want to make things grow right, to rein in that errant sapling. These precepts, the moral essence distilled by philosophers, he distinguishes this from example, which are the second-hand goods trafficked in by historians. Sir Philip writes, "The philosopher and the historian are they which would win the goal, the one by precept, the other by example. But both, not having both, do both halt." And alas, how quickly a copy editor would take out that last sentence. But in any case, Sidney goes on. The historian, wanting the precept, wanting the rule, wanting the norm, is so tied, not to what should be, but to what is, to the particular truth of things, and not to the general reason of things, that his example draweth no necessary consequence, and therefore a less fruitful doctrine. So tonight, in stenographic form, I've tried to indicate what we make of these particular truths of things. Okay, steer you away, perhaps, at least temporarily, from the right, the straight, the normal, and get at this irreducible. 4 p.m., if you wish to know, that is when the accident took place. That is when Express Train 56, scheduled to arrive from Granville at 3:55, exited through the facade of the station, landing the Place des Rennes. And we know this because the clock on the wall, which felt the tremor, which was transmitted throughout this extraordinary, by the extraordinary force of this locomotive, jettisoned through the front, came to a stop at that very moment. The clock comes to rest, giving silent witness to the fact of the moment, the during, the incident. That incident we have to surround with so much before and after. But returning to the heroes of the day, Perrin and Garnier are engineers, models of both courage and cold-bloodedness, Vibert tells us. And he says what cannot be emphasized enough is their presence of mind. He says, in the face of appalling danger, and in less time than it takes to write of it, they saved the lives of more than 120 passengers on the express train from Granville. Which is to say, it certainly takes longer to write about these accidents than it takes for them to occur, unless we consider that longer durée. Which is to say simply that writing history takes time. It is indeed one fucking thing after another. So thank you very much for your attention, and